Like Alireza Firouzja, jan-krzysztof Duda is a chess prodigy and he'll be doing battle with Alireza Firouzja in all of the coming years to see who will be the greatest chess player of this rising generation of stars. And the battle was well and truly on at Norway Chess 2020, which I'm rewinding to in this video. I want to take a look at this tournament and the amazing decisive games that Alireza played in this one. So this was round one. Duda had white here and he kicks off with e4. Alireza goes in for his favourite Caro-Kann defence. Now we had d4 on the board, pawn to d5, knight c3. We had a captures in the centre, the knight centralised, black hits it with the bishop, so the knight drops into g3 and that bishop nudges back to g6. All seen many times before. Pawn h4 now played. Really standard idea in these structures, gaining some space. h6 gives the bishop some room. Now we had knight to f3, knight d7, pawn h5 kicks the bishop, and after it drops back, you've gained that space. Then you swap the bishops in the centre like this. The queen comes into d3. And after pawn e6, bishop to d2, the knight came to f6 here, and white castled queenside here. So looks aggressive, but now how black plays dictates the rest of the game. So you can go queen c7 here. This is very common, and after say knight e4, you castle queenside. But what Alireza does here is he goes bishop to e7 instead. And so after king b1, now he castles kingside, and we're in for this tense, exciting game. Kings castled on the opposite sides of the board. So the knight came to e4 now, not only centralising that piece, but also looking to get g4, g5 very quickly. Black has to be really careful. So you can take this knight immediately. After queen takes, swing the other one round. What Alireza does is go pawn to c5 immediately. This is a classic break in the centre. When you're about to get attacked on the flank, you have to play quickly in the centre of the board. And now Duda doesn't respond in the best way here. So there are different moves which keep him with an advantage. He could take on c5, he could take on f6. He can even play an immediate g4 here as a gambit line. That's very interesting. But what he does is bishop to e3. And it's just a bit passive really, because Alireza can now take here, the queen recaptures, knight f6. And now if you come back to d3 here, black can get a good game like this with say rook to c8, say white captures on c5. We could have the queens coming off, bishop takes here. Black is a little better really. This pawn could actually become a weakness soon. So Duda didn't really want to be going down this line of a slightly worse endgame, not much to play for. So after knight f6 hitting the queen, he actually took the plunge, took up the gauntlet and took the pawn on b7. Now this is dangerous because you're opening the b file to your own king. So Alireza immediately goes knight to d5, not only centralising that piece, but freeing the bishop to come to this f6 square, look at the king. There's also now ideas to bring a rook to the b file, attacking the king, opening up these knight c3 check ideas. So the queen came to a6, anticipating that. Rook to b8 anyway, bishop d2, covered this knight's jumps along this diagonal. Now the pawn captured on d4, the knight recaptured here, and the bishop hit f6. So a beautiful position for black already. Now the knight came back to b3, looking to block that b file. The queen came to c7 developing. This rook came to the centre of the board. Rook c8 was played. This one's now attacked, and so it had to be covered with the rook here. And now if you want to pause a moment and think how you might play as black here, then please do so. Which piece needs improving? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button to let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a video if you haven't done so already. So the best move in this position for black is knight to b6 here. So it drops back, and the reason for that is because the rook is already very well placed, so are these heavy pieces. The bishop looks wonderful, but now this knight is spinning round into this c4 square. So Duda goes rook to e4, and after knight c4, he reveals his point, which is bishop to f4. That move is now supported by the rook here. It skewers queen and rook along this one. Now you don't want to go pawn e5 to block that out. After, say, bishop to e3, this bishop's now really ugly. You turned it into a very bad piece. So instead, queen b6 was played. An excellent move to solve the problems. You don't have time to pick up the rook or you lose your queen. So the queens came off the board. The rook recaptured, but the attack rages on for black. There's still lots of pressure against this b2 pawn. So bishop e3 played, hits the rook. Now you don't want to capture that one. You instantly blow your advantage. After the pawn recaptures, you're actually just a pawn down here as black without much to play for. So instead we had rook to b4. And there was a threat to actually go knight a3 check and win this undefended rook on e4. So f3 played, and now black would still love to move this knight to take on e3 or take on b2, but the rook's undefended, so pawn a5 played. And now it's very tough for white. There's lots of threats in the air, the pawn coming to a4, the knight coming in here. Say you tried c3, well then the rook can simply drop back, and there's still massive problems coming with pawn a4, plus this knight would be undefended if you go a4 yourself. So that's why in this position, Duda actually chopped on c4. He sacks an exchange here, but he's trying to alleviate the pressure, and after the rook recaptures, he's also winning a pawn. So bishop d2, the rook moved away, he takes here, and he's hoping that these three connected passed pawns on the queen side will win the game for him over that side of the board. But it's tough, because Alireza now picks up on h5 and his own pawns are also coming very quickly. So rook g1 played, holding this g pawn. You can't afford to lose that too quickly. And now the best practical decision here for Alireza would have been rook c to h4, preparing to exchange rooks, then go after this one, push the kingside pawns. But what Alireza does is rook to b5, has some points, frees the way for the h pawn immediately, eyes this b2 pawn, but it does give white lots of counterplay now. So bishop to d2 played, clearing the way for the a pawn, spinning back round into the game. We had pawn h5, pawn to c3, blocks out this bishop, pawn to g5, king c2, this one came to g4, and now the knight moves out of the way, preparing to reposition and freeing the way for the pawns here. And now the best practical decision for black would have been takes on f3. Then Duda could recapture, Alireza could play the king up here, and he's got a target here. The h pawn is a passed pawn, decent chances. But what Alireza does here is go pawn to g3. Now there are points to this too. If you ever pick up this pawn, this will be very dangerous. This one can come very quickly, but it is a double-edged way to play because b3 now comes, the rook goes away, pawn a4, rook f5, white is really getting going on the queen side now. So the knight came to e2 here, pawn h4, pawn c4 from Duda. They're coming up to time control, and this is the final move of move 40, pawn e5 from Alireza. So a very ugly move. It keeps the knight out of this square, but kills this bishop. And bishop e3 was an excellent response from Duda, coming onto this diagonal, supporting these pawns in the future. So Alireza went bishop to g5. You just can't live with that powerful piece sitting there. We had the exchange here, the rook recaptured, and now the white rook nudges over, hits this pawn, Alireza defends, and now Duda had an excellent opportunity to equalise the game. So he could have taken on g3 here using this pin. Now the rook would have come to g5, the knight can come to e4, we take on g2 with check, king c3, and then the rook should go somewhere. That's the best move, either to e2 or back to g6, let's say, and then white will pick up this pawn. And in a practical game, I'd prefer to be white here with these ones coming very fast on the queen side. But Duda didn't see it, or if he did, he assessed it as not so great. So he went king c3 instead. Now we had pawn f5. Still you can play this, although it's not as strong anymore because now you don't have the e4 square for the knight. So b4 was played instead. Pawn f4 shuts out any knight g3 stuff, and now it's really tricky for Duda. Probably best here was knight g1, covering this h3 pawn break, But what Duda does is go pawn a5. He wants to get those ones going, yes, but now Alireza can get this h3 move in, and this is key. Now the pawn took here. If you go with the rook, this is possible. Black would swap, pawn recaptures. Now my trusty assistant tells me rook a8 is the best move. You stop b5 really, because then you can take here. There's also e4 ideas in the air. Should be good for black, but it's still very, very tricky, I have to say. But what Duda did here was take with the pawn. And now Alireza goes e4. This is the key follow-up. Now we had a captures here. If you take on f4, the problem is the rook can come to f5. You can even allow the knight to come to d5 and e7. The point being, you're actually connecting these two pawns. They're coming down the board here on the 6th rank. Even if you lose a whole rook, everything's just too slow for white. You're going to make a queen. It's completely winning. So we didn't have takes on f4. Instead, Duda took on e4 here, but now we had pawn to g2. The rook had to give ground. Takes here with check, and after the king went away, pawn to f3. So white's just getting steamrolled. The pawn came to c5, and now you want to push this pawn on here, but then the rook can take with check. So Alireza simply went king f7, and after knight f4, pawn f2, here Duda resigned. Those pawns are going through, the game is lost. So an awesome game between these two young players, really exciting times ahead for the future. If you want to see another amazing Alireza Firouzja game, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.